Most of the portraits included in this exhibition are what historians of the Dutch Golden Age might call a tronie, a character type painted from imagination. There is one formal portrait of an actual person, and there are also a couple which are painted from models, but the rest are idealized types. Most of my portraits are also based on famous examples of portraiture from art history, such as the Mona Lisa and Vermeer's Girl with a Pearl Earring, to say nothing of works by Titian and Rembrandt. My portrait of Roger Bacon, a 13th century Franciscan theologian and philosopher, is based on a tronie by Rembrandt van Rijn on display at the Fogg Museum. The face is obviously different, but the composition is very similar. I chose to paint a Franciscan friar, minus the tonsure, because the Franciscan habit is vaguely similar to the clothing in Rembrandt's painting, and I also wanted to make a painting specifically of Roger Bacon in recognition of the pivotal role which he and other Franciscans played in launching the Italian Renaissance. I did my best to reproduce Rembrandt's technique. The particular painting which I used as my guide was done in 1632, and so belongs to the beginning of Rembrandt's career, when his methods were still relatively conventional. Working on panel, I began with an umber wash drawing, and I used a limited palette of earth colors throughout, using the transparency and opacity of the paint to create variations of color, just as Rembrandt would. Raw umber accounts for about 90% of the picture, from the brilliant ruddy browns of the Franciscan habit, which are achieved by glazing raw umber, to the grayish browns in the background, achieved by scumbling, a mixture of raw umber and lead white. A glaze is a semi-transparent application of darker paint over a lighter ground, while a scumble is a lighter mixture over a darker ground. Glazes extend the range of a limited palette by making the color brighter and warmer, while scumbles do the same by making the color grayer and cooler. I didn't manage to preserve as much transparency as Rembrandt's painting has, since I had to make too many corrections, and my style is a bit heavy-handed in comparison to the jaw-dropping virtuosity of an autograph Rembrandt. But the result is worthy of Rembrandt's studio, I think, be it the hand of Nicolas Maes, Gerard Dow, or Ferdinand Bol. Since we don't strictly know what Roger Bacon looked like, my painting is based on a widely circulated portrait of Roger Bacon dating to the 18th century. As early as the 1260s, Bacon was among the very first to propose that churches should be decorated with naturalistic art, the better to communicate the mysteries of the faith. The patronage which Giotto subsequently received from the Franciscans and the Dominicans was intended to do what Bacon had recommended. The mendicant orders were the original patrons of Renaissance art. Bertrand is the earliest painting in the exhibition, dating all the way back to 2010. It was inspired by Titian's portraits in the Musée du Louvre. After finishing my studies in Florence, I spent a year in Paris, mostly for the purpose of studying the collections in the Louvre and the Musée d'Orsay. More or less every day was spent in one museum or another, taking notes on color and composition and so forth, doing the occasional sketch, and then heading back to my studio in Bagnolet, a suburb of Paris, to do some painting. This portrait is of a Frenchman whose name was Bertrand, who was generous enough to sit for me and the two other artists with whom I was sharing the studio. Being tremendously impressed by the subtle variations of tone in Titian's Portrait of a Man with a Glove, I tried to reproduce a similar tonal scheme in my portrait of Bertrand. There is a story about Titian, which my teacher, John Angel, liked to repeat, that a student once marveled at the variety of Titian's blacks and asked the master how he achieved such subtleties, to which Titian replied, "With brains, my boy, with brains." Judging from my own experience of painting Bertrand, I would have to say that it has just as much to do with elbow grease, because it was a laborious business modeling the dark background, the black clothing, and the hair properly within such a narrow value range. Unfortunately, none of this variation could be captured in the photograph. Unlike most of my paintings, which are keyed for typical indoor lighting, Bertrand has to be seen under a bright, natural light to bring out the variations in the darks. La Fiorentina follows a type found in the works of Raphael and Andrea del Sarto, based on Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Raphael and Del Sarto adopted the pose of the Mona Lisa in several different paintings, but in most cases replaced Leonardo's landscape with a dark background, and for Leonardo's murky coloring, they substituted stark local colors in the usual Florentine manner. The color scheme of my painting is taken from Del Sarto, who used a slightly purple-blue backdrop against a pale red drape in several paintings of the Blessed Virgin Mary, including altarpieces of the Annunciation and the Assumption, which are now in the Palazzo Pitti. The character of the face is particularly indebted to Raphael, while the deep shadows and sfumato are of course indebted to Leonardo himself. The cropping of La Fiorentina is a little tight because it was originally going to be a study for a larger half-length painting including hands and torso following Leonardo's convention. I've not gotten around to doing this yet, but I will be returning to it in the future. The portrait of a woman with a pearl earring is obviously a nod to Vermeer's famous Girl with a Pearl Earring. She wears similar clothing and, of course, the requisite pearl. The most conspicuous difference is that my portrait is in profile. Vermeer's use of the three-quarter portrait was the culmination of a tradition of female portraiture begun by Leonardo da Vinci. In the early Renaissance of the Quattrocento, most portraits were painted in profile, but in search of a greater sense of life and movement, Leonardo began to paint portraits at an angle, and it was not long before the profile fell almost entirely out of the portraitist repertoire. It was only in the 19th century that the profile portrait really came back into vogue, and so the style of my painting straddles three different eras, from the early Renaissance to the Dutch Golden Age to the 19th century. The inspiration behind my next profile portrait is a striking portrait of a girl painted circa 1880 by Frederick Leighton, which is similarly distinguished by a brilliant coif of ruddy blonde hair. Leighton's deft, painterly handling of the hair puts my attempt at imitation to shame, but it is no great humiliation to fall somewhat short of so high a mark. Of the late 19th century academicians, Leighton is easily my favorite because his style is uniquely cosmopolitan. He trained first in Germany and then in Italy and finally in Paris. His work strongly reflects the influence of the Nazarene school in Germany, who invented a very elegant Neo-Raphaelite style of painting. Eschewing the decadent virtuosity of the 18th century, the Nazarenes wanted to return to the simple purity of Renaissance painting, and for my money they succeeded. By the time that Leighton began his studies, many of the Nazarenes had become influential teachers in the German academies. Although Leighton would not confine himself to religious subjects like the Nazarenes, the idealization of his form has all the hallmarks of the Nazarene school, augmented by other influences from Italy and France. As a 19th century style painting, my portrait of a young woman is complemented by an elegant 19th century frame from circa 1875, which matches the picture perfectly. My third profile portrait was inspired by an 1881 portrait entitled The Soap Bubbles by Charles Joshua Chaplin, who specialized in decorative female portraits. I changed the cropping and reinvented the face, the hair, and the background while retaining the clothing and the pose from Chaplin's painting. She is framed in a very delicate 19th century American frame in beautiful condition from circa 1890. The White Rose is based on a painting by Jean-Baptiste Greuze entitled The White Hat, circa 1780, in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The following is the description of the White Hat from the MFA's online catalog. Although Greuze was commissioned to paint many portraits, it's unlikely that this painting depicts an actual person. The young woman, who appears at once innocent and seductive, is probably the product of the artist's imagination. Greuze has dressed her in the more natural déshabillé, undressed fashion that was en vogue at the time. Queen Marie Antoinette began wearing white muslin dresses that did not require structural undergarments in the 1780s, and after some initial scandal, the style became very popular. My portrait is likewise painted from imagination, which was more challenging than it should have been. I started this painting all the way back in 2013, and after repainting it several times, I finally finished it this year. I initially copied the style of undress in Greuze's painting, but ultimately decided against it. It's best to reserve gratuitous nudity for subjects that have some allegorical justification for it. The nudity in Greuze's painting works because his style is not too realistic. And at first, I tried to make my own painting look quite a bit more idealized. But the best solution in the end was to make her look like a real person. The painting is appropriately framed in an 18th century French style in a reproduction Louis XV frame with an oval liner. Urania draws on both Florentine and Venetian traditions. The pose and headdress were inspired by the Garvach Madonna by Raphael in the National Gallery in London. The exposed shoulder and hair are an allusion to Titian's painting of Flora in the Uffizi Gallery. The painting is also inspired by 17th century Florentine paintings, for example by Francesco Farini, who painted similar decorative images of beautiful young women. This painting was intended to be more idealized and have the soft atmosphere of Farini's paintings, but unfortunately this did not work out. And like the White Rose, I had to settle for a simpler, more naturalistic solution. The title Urania refers to the muse of astronomy, who typically wears blue and white and is often pointing to a globe and holding a compass. I decided not to include these accoutrements and instead used a glistening strand of pearls to suggest her connection to the celestial bodies. Unlike most of my female portraits, Juliane is in fact of a real person as opposed to an idealized type. I painted her as a study with the intention of introducing her face into what is otherwise a copy of a painting by William Bouguereau. I think that my head study turned out better than the copy, though both are a success. Most of this painting is copied directly from William Bouguereau's Première Rêverie, also known as Whisperings of Love. Bouguereau's painting was completed in 1889 and can be found at the New Orleans Museum of Art, which I visited several years ago. Besides the cropping and the scale, the primary differences between my painting and Bouguereau's are the Cupid, which I chose to discard, and the head, which I repainted entirely using my own portrait of Juliane as a model. I wanted to include at least one homage to Bouguereau in the exhibition, given his importance to the Atelier movement. The portrait of Loren Chase Eastman depicts one of the founders of the Loren Rogers Museum in Laurel, Mississippi. He was the grandfather of the museum's namesake, Loren Eastman Rogers, who died tragically in 1921 at the age of 23. In addition to endowing the museum, Eastman also donated his own private collection of 19th and early 20th century paintings, which still comprises the core of the museum's collection. I have a personal connection to the Loren Rogers Museum because my father's family hails from Jones County in Mississippi, and my mother also happens to work there. The portrait is being donated to the museum. The accompanying photograph of Loren Chase Eastman, which is in the public domain, is what I had to work from. My portrait of John Singleton Copley is a copy of a self-portrait which he did and can be found in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. I painted it on the occasion of a lecture that I gave on Copley's life here at the Copley Society in 2019.